Okay, so in this lesson then, I'm going to give you a class overview and really explain what to expect out of these video lessons. Okay. Now, the PMP exam is very challenging. Make sure you understand that. This is a challenging exam. It's not an easy exam by any means. You have to study. You have to put in the time to study. However, you also need to have the right mindset and the right approach to studying. Right? You need to understand how to first approach this class and how to study afterwards. Okay? And that really is what this lesson is all about. Now, there are many different ways of managing a project, right? Different industries manage projects differently. An IT project, for example, is managed very differently to a construction project, which is managed very differently to a marketing project, which is managed very differently to a research and development project or a pharmaceutical project. Every industry manages projects differently. There's many different methodologies out there, right? There's no right or wrong way of managing a project. There's obviously a good and bad way of managing a project, but there are many different ways, many different methodologies, and different industries, different organizations manage projects their own way. Okay. Now, there's many factors that go into how you manage a project as well, such as, for example, geographical location. Right? You're going to manage a project differently in one part of the world compared to another part of the world. Right? Just for example, there might be some cultural differences, regulatory differences. So even the same project, you'd be managing differently in another part of the world. Now, what PMI have done is they've taken all these different factors into consideration, all these factors that impact your project, and all these factors we're going to be discussing as we go through these video lessons. What PMI have done is taken all these factors into consideration and really created their own generic standard, if you like. Right? They've created a standard for project management or a framework for project management. And it's this standard and framework that is documented in PMBOK. So every few years they update those standards. So currently the latest version of PMBOK that's being tested on the exam is PMBOK version 6. Right? Now, here's something very important to understand. The PMP exam is testing your knowledge and understanding of PMI's standards. It's testing your knowledge and understanding of the PMI framework of project management. That's what the PMP exam is testing. It is not testing how good of a project manager you are. It is not testing how well you manage projects in your organization or in your industry. The PMP exam is testing your knowledge and understanding of PMI's standards, of PMI's framework. And that's what this class is about. This class is here purely and simply, we are preparing you to pass the PMP exam. I'm not preparing you to manage a project. I'm not teaching you how to manage a project. We are going to teach you how to pass the PMP exam. Right? And that's something very important to understand. Right? Because now you basically almost have to unlearn everything you've learned about project management. You have to put that at the back of your mind. Right? And why? Well, because you have to think in terms of PMI standards now. You have to think the PMI way. When you are answering a question, right, typically you'll get a scenario question, multiple choice, there'll be 4 option choices, and one of those option choices will be correct. Typically what's going to happen, right, it's very tempting. Look at the option choices and choose the best option that you would take or the best approach that you would take in your line of work. But you have to take a step back because that might not be in line with PMI standards. You always have to think which of these is in line with PMI standards. So, as I said, you almost have to unlearn everything you've learned about project management. You have to put that at the back of your mind, right, and start thinking PMI standards. Now, some of these standards you might not agree with. There's some stuff that we are going to be teaching you that you might not necessarily agree with. In fact, there's a whole bunch of stuff we're going to teach you that I don't necessarily agree with. Kimberly doesn't necessarily agree with. But it makes no difference whether we agree or whether we don't agree. When you're answering a PMP exam question, you have to answer it based on their standards, based on PMI standards. And that's something very, very important to understand. So part of passing the PMP exam is exam technique. There's a lot of curveballs that PMI throw at you on the exam. Right, they'll give you irrelevant information, or they'll give you irrelevant scenarios altogether. Right, so you need to be able to learn to pick out key words and key phrases. Right? You need to be able to navigate through these ambiguous questions. Many questions are going to be ambiguous. Right? You're reading a question, sometimes you're wondering what they're even asking, or you're looking at option choices, they all look good, they all look correct. Right? So there might be just one key word here and there that's separating the correct answer from the wrong answers. So you need to learn how to pick out those keywords. Right? And again, something we're going to be covering during this class. Right? Now, the only way of learning all of that is by going through practice questions. Right? You need to practice what you learn. Okay? Now, many of you are aware that the exam changed in 2021. Right? So now there are 3 domains, right? We talk about 3 domains, right? You have something called the people domain, right? The process domain and the business environment domain, right? So the exam is based off of those 3 domains. Now, the old PMBOK domains though, right? So the PMBOK guide, right? So a 6th edition is really currently what is being tested, or the exam is partly based off of the 6th edition. There was 5 process groups: initiating, planning, execute, monitoring, controlling, and closing. You still need to know that, right? You still need to be aware of the processes, right? But one of the other things that PMI added to the exam, or changed in January of 2021, is the fact that now 50% of the exam is agile and 50% is predictive, right? Predictive is your traditional waterfall style of project management. Whereas agile is a completely different approach. Right? And they're almost like 2 conflicting approaches to project management. However, you need to know both approaches. 50% of the exam is agile, 50% is predictive. So the PMBOK guide really refers to the predictive side. Right? The PMBOK guide doesn't really have as much bearing on agile as it does predictive. Right? We always recommend becoming a member of PMI, and then you can download a free copy of the PMBOK guide, and you can also download a free copy of the Agile Practice Guide as well. And for both of them, we just recommend using them as a reference guide. Okay, so the PMBOK guide version 6 and the Agile Practice Guide, right, you can download them for free from the pmi.org website if you're a member of PMI. Right, and then those are useful resources just as a reference guide. Okay, so one of the key things though to understand, right, the PMBOK guide is not a textbook. It's not a textbook for managing a project. It's not a textbook for passing the PMP exam. The PMBOK guide is just there as a framework, right? It's just a reference guide for project managers, just setting the standards for project management. That's really all it is. And really, it's just setting the standards for predictive projects. Right, so remember, you need to understand both predictive and agile. Okay, so make sure then you can think in terms of PMI. And when you're taking the exam, you have to think in terms of PMI's standards, and you have to think in terms of both predictive as well as agile.